What's up, everybody? I'm Thomas J. Bellezza, and welcome to another video, another lesson on the Right Mindset channel. Thank you so much for coming out. Today, we are going to go over an antagonist's presence in your story, their presence in the story, and also if you have the presence and how it influences the world, and also the potential of having two or more villains within your story. This lesson is more about the presence of an antagonist and less about the physical dealings with the antagonistic force. How your antagonist influence your story world and the protagonist. So how their presence in your world influences the story, the world, and the protagonist. And the power of having two or more villains that stand in the way of victory. All I'm saying is, let's get right to it. Time for us to develop the right mindset. What? Love that intro. Anyway, today's lesson again is the presence of an antagonist in your story. A big, massive thank you to everyone's out there listening, supporting, and following this channel. If you're new here and you end up liking the video and you want to watch some of the other videos, please go right back. If you can, subscribe, like, comment on the video. We love comments. We love answering questions. Please hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you don't miss out. Let's get right into it. Whew. The presence of an antagonist is important. When you wake up in the morning, you probably know who's in your house. You have a pretty good idea of who lives in your house with you. You might not see them directly in front of you, but their routine of making coffee, using the bathroom, all come from familiarity. You know their presence in your house and you feel it, even if you don't see them. And when they leave the house or you leave the house, you feel different, even in a small or big way, depending on their presence or the influence of their presence. Their presence has influenced you in a positive or negative way, and therefore their presence is something you recognize. You feel it and you take notice to it. This is true with your story when it comes to your antagonistic force pushing back at your protagonist, even before they physically meet. What makes the journey of storytelling difficult is we forget that what's going on in the world around us actually influences us. We're focused on what we see now in front of us. That out of sight, out of mind mentality is absolutely a normal thing, and it's not negative if that's how you're going to tell your story. If we're going to be like, we're just going to focus on what we're dealing with right now. This doesn't mean that the presence of life around you isn't influencing you, though. And that's something to keep in mind as a writer, especially when it is a major thing going on. A massive storm is coming, a war beginning, even the death of a family or friend set in sight by a cruel and evil disease. The antagonistic force is influencing the story, even if they're not, like if a character's not directly dealing with the war or dealing with the disease, but they know it's out there and they heard about it, the world around them is being influenced by that. We know that in storytelling, the antagonistic or the antagonist is the opponent or combatant working against the protagonist's goal, basically antagonizing the hell out of them. And they create the main conflict. The antagonist can be one character or a group of characters. In traditional narratives, the antagonist is synonymous with the bad guy. If you haven't watched my other videos, to sum it up, it's important. If you haven't watched my other videos on antagonists and protagonists and who they are and what they are, which is in this series, you can go back and watch the other videos. Basically, It's important to develop all your characters, and in doing so, you want to create an antagonistic force as a fully dimensional figure as much as you would for the protagonist, even if the antagonistic force is like a natural disaster or a sickness or a concept. Okay, you still want it to have some sort of full life and development. Keep in mind that according to the rules of how plot dynamics work, the antagonist functions primarily as a catalyst for the protagonist's choice, actions, and development. Development. This is why, in most narratives, the best approach is to view your antagonist less as an equal player within the story structure and more as a force that moves the protagonist through the structural arc. Basically, the hero's journey, or kill the cat outlines, or your traditional 1, 2, 3 act, or your sometimes you have a 4-act structure, and it's just you got to go here and then right. Think of this as a chance to have a zoomed out mechanical perspective that can help you prevent the problem of an antagonist taking over the story. Okay. The thing is, to clarify that, your antagonist doesn't necessarily have to be front and center. If it's an antagonistic force that is supernatural, or it's nature based, or it is your villain of the week. It is a Darth Vader, right? For example, in Star Wars, the Empire has influence over the story. In fact, they talk about it even before we meet the Empire, before we meet anybody in the Empire, before we meet that antagonistic force. And by the way, if you think about it, Star Wars kind of has 3 antagonists. They have the troopers, right? Because they're the ones searching for Luke. You have Darth Vader, and then you have the Emperor, who's never seen in the first one. They just talk about the Emperor, and they're like, "Hey, this exists." Okay. So by zooming out the story and giving yourself a look, going, how does the presence of that antagonistic force influence my story, and how can I develop my story based on that influence? Okay. Things to properly consider. Okay. Antagonists plot role in your hook. So while you have a story, right? Again, they don't have to directly be the antagonist. They could just be within it. They could exist within the story. And when you're dealing with the hook, or plot point 1, which is known as the ordinary world, you might look at it as an antagonist will be at work on their own plot goals, probably with no correlation to the protagonist whatsoever at this stage of the story. And yes, they can directly correlate with your protagonist, but they don't necessarily have to. You will mostly see, in fantasy, of course, moments where the goal of the antagonist does directly involve the protagonist, but at this particular point, the antagonist may approach or initiate contact with the protagonist in the scene. However, since the protagonist has not yet formed their own specific plot goal, they are unlikely to cause or suffer from direct conflict with the antagonist. Basically, the protagonist was in a city that was attacked by the antagonistic force, who was really there for someone else, but this war dislocated the protagonist into a new life and indirectly destroyed the life of the protagonist. Okay? In other words, the antagonistic force, or in that example, is happening around the protagonist and not directly to the protagonist. Like, they didn't attack the city to kill the protagonist. It didn't so happen the city was there, and the city was in the way of getting to the protagonist. It's just that the protagonist was in the city and it was being destroyed. In that situation, they don't have a personal connection outside of being influenced by the actions of the evil happening. Which brings us to the inciting incident, plot point 2, the antagonist's role within the inciting incident. Something you see in spy thrillers, the protagonist works for a specific department, say the CIA, or how about Bond, James Bond, right? I'm Bond, James Bond. And they are not directly related to the antagonistic force. They're just on a mission, right? They are someone who has a job and thus must make an effort to move in and stop that force. Okay? In this situation, the antagonist doesn't even know or care about the protagonist, or if they do, it's not the first thing on their mind until the protagonistic force begins making problems for the antagonist. With that said, the antagonist will face their own inciting incident within the story, technically. Although they may not realize that, they are deep into it. They are deep into their own plans and brushing up against the main narrative conflict. That means they're both influencing each other, but not at the direct desire to influence each other. They're just doing the things they are doing, and it just so happens it's influencing the other person. What's happening here is that the antagonist is going to indirectly influence the world in a way that will make the protagonist their primary opponent, as they are now on the brink of becoming an obstacle for the protagonist. In some stories, the antagonist will be aware of the protagonist as a potential problem and will react in some way, which will probably lead to the first plot point, causing the protagonist to become fully involved with them in the main conflict. However, it is not uncommon for the antagonistic force to remain mutually unaware of the protagonist as a threat, or even know they are there. To sum that up, if we're looking at the spy analogy, James Bond is told, hey, look, there's somebody trying to steal the plans. We don't know who it is. Can you look into it? And then the antagonist is going, all right, I have these plans. I'm going to use them to start killing the undercover spies and also selling to the black market. Well, James Bond is searching out that information. They discover who it is. It turns out they're an ex-agent of MI6, right? And now they have a name. And that person is now like, oh, Bond is getting a little close. I'm not really worried about it. Wait a minute. I could use them to help me get to my target. So I'm going to allow them to get me. And it's like they aren't directly influencing each other's story. It just so happens James Bond was in the wrong place at the wrong time, therefore instigating an in for the baddie, right? And you could look at it that way as well when you're working on stories. Like, you don't always have to have the antagonist and the protagonist be directly involved with each other. The antagonist's plan can be influencing the world of the protagonist and sometimes being the complete backdrop. And then over the course of the story, maybe leading to the midpoint, they become the primary story. So the inciting incident could lead the protagonist on a thing. For example, the villain in the Bond movie stole the plans, but they don't know who the villain is. That's the inciting incident for both characters, technically. I stole the plans. Now I can actually enact my plan to mess up MI6. And now MI6 is like, we have to fight back. Bond, figure out who the bad person is. So they're not necessarily, they're entwined, but they're not directly influencing each other. They don't even know who each other is yet. The bad guy doesn't know Bond is coming after him, and Bond doesn't know who the bad guy is. Okay. Another thing that you could look at is in plot point 8, the first pinch or plot twist. The antagonistic force will certainly make an appearance, if by proxy only, at this point in the story. Some element of the antagonistic force will become aware of the protagonist in some capacity at this point. Even if that antagonist is not yet directly concerned with the protagonist's ability to obstruct their goals, they will at least recognize the threat and move to protect themselves from the protagonist in some way or another. As an aside, again, it might not be the antagonists themselves. It could be the force of the antagonist directly meeting the protagonist. Their influence on the world directly reaching them, a higher valued minion or person of status in the group, therefore, or ergo, two or more villains. So we're seeing like an underling. So the underling is dealing with the protagonist now because the antagonistic force has made movement to here, etc., etc. This usually happens with Bond, and like they have like the secondary minion and stuff, the secondary villain. Anyway, whatever the situation is, the connection between both protagonist and antagonist will be definitive, as the domino effect for both characters will eventually begin to fall. Their encounter with each other at this point, the plot point or the plot twist, creates consequences, and their successes, attempts to grapple with those consequences, will engineer the entirety of the plot conflict to follow. Now we get to the push into the new world, plot point 9. This is the end of basically this is the last plot point of Act 1 of the 27 plot point outline structure. The antagonistic force will probably make some sort of move against the protagonist here. In one way or another, the antagonistic force will achieve an incidental victory at the expense of the protagonist. Due to the presence of the antagonistic force, the actual antagonist will have things at stake in this moment too. Specifically in the context of the antagonists seemingly being able to protect themselves better than the protagonist is able to protect themselves. In achieving this minor victory, whether physical or psychological, the antagonist will also have sacrificed a little something something. Their hand is shown in one way or another, at least in part. Therefore, the protagonist will have gained information or insight about the antagonist. These new clues could be the antagonist's plans revealing within the main conflict and or about the thematic context in which both characters are operating. Whatever you choose with your narrative, this moment will help the protagonist understand enough to lead them directly into the midpoint conflict of the story. In James Bond, he discovers that there's this island, and on that island, basically, the bad guy lives on the island. So now they have a better idea of where the bad guy is. They gain some insight. They understand what their potential plot is. And James Bond is like, "Hey, I'm gonna go on this boat. Take me to the island." You know. In Star Wars, it's Owen, Uncle Owen, dies. Right, that's the inciting incident, which leads them all the way to finding Han Solo. And then turns out they discovered the robots, the androids, and Han Solo and Luke get attacked because a spy or somebody gave up their location and who they were to the stormtroopers, and they have to leave the planet. And once they leave the planet, we are in Act 2. So it comes out that they now know the protagonist is trying to get the plans to try to save Princess Leia, whatever the case may be, and the stormtroopers or the antagonistic force now know that the droids themselves have been found and spotted, and they're on the what the hell is an aluminum falcon? So they are pushed into the Act 2, and that is what point 9 looks like in a story. All right. Let's go a little further in. We're going to jump some steps just to kind of get this understanding. So the midpoint conflict, which is plot point 14, this is the moment when the protagonist and the antagonist come together in a significant confrontation, usually. In this situation in Star Wars, Vader kills Obi-Wan Kenobi. All right, that's the midpoint conflict. They just have to escape the Death Star, and they do. Okay, what is the immediate consequence to that? What is point 15? In Star Wars, it would be that they have to fight off the TIE fighters, and they have to get out of there. The ship won't go into hyperdrive. They have to escape. That's basically okay. Anyway, often, also they have the plan, so they get to set up a plan. So they meet with the resistance, the rebels, and they go, "Hey, we got the plan." So they set up a plan, which after all that is said and done, Luke says, "I'm going to fight." Han says, "I'm going to leave and pay off my debts." And then Act 3 begins. Okay. So let's jump back to plot point 14, which is your midpoint. How does the antagonist really influence this? Like I was saying, the protagonist and the antagonist usually, meet and have a significant confrontation at this point. In The Edge of Tomorrow, no, what is it? Stupid movie. Movie with whoa, uh, movie with Jake Jill. Uh, End of the world. The day after tomorrow. So the midpoint conflict, how they come together, the main conflict, right? So this is using nature as an example. They're in that library, they're freezing together. The ice age has reached this city, and him and all his friends are curled up by the fire trying to survive with their heat in their body, and you could see like the ice coming into like the windows and everything like that. So the antagonistic force has reached the protagonist, and they have a confrontation. Will he be frozen to death, or will he survive? That's really what's going on there. So it's pretty interesting. So even in that situation, it's not a physical force as in like I'm a bad guy. It's nature and it's doing its job. Okay. Often the antagonist during the midpoint conflict will be the one who seems to emerge victorious. A common writing tool is to allow the midpoint to function as a major wake-up call for your protagonist. We've gone over this in my outlining videos. Feel free to watch that playlist. The antagonistic force may have come off as victorious, but is often the result of the antagonist making big moves. Okay. Moves that potentially show the protagonist any holes in their approach. Oh. The antagonist may win the midpoint as a result, but because they fail, by the way, win, if they fail to walk away with the same insight as the protagonist. Because the reason the antagonist wins and then walks away with no real insight is because they were victorious. They feel they are doing what they are meant to do. They didn't really learn from it. But the protagonist does learn because they fail. And because these two things happen, the game has changed, but the antagonist will not find the capacity to grow or adapt in the second half of their narrative, which is your narrative. And they'll continue on their path, therefore exposing something of a 2-meter size hole, right? This is why the antagonistic force and the antagonist usually leave the midpoint conflict from a place of power. But you know what they say, arrogance is the downfall when you feel superior. And as someone who's extremely humble, I know this. All right. Okay, I made that one up. But it sounds about right, right? Arrogance is the downfall when you feel superior. I don't know. Take that as you may. Hey, making the antagonist have weight. So, real quick, there is a benefit to breaking down the antagonistic force into multiple antagonists. Okay? Think of some of your favorite video games and how you have level bosses and eventually the final boss. Okay. Well, narratives have the same thing, sometimes not in the form of actual level bosses, but still they are there. Think of the movie Weird Science. They had the bullies in the mall. They had bullies that were in the mall. Damn you, Robert Downey Jr. You had Wyatt's older brother, Chet Donnelly, who comes back later and is defeated. The bikers who came to the party for the final resolution. You also have the parents, like they don't want their kids dating. Not the parent. The grandparents don't want one of the kids dating the girl because the weird science woman, is a very mature woman, even though she's supposedly fake. And of course, keep in mind, after that, the two protagonists' personal battle for victory. When confidence becomes their strength, they get the real women. They learn to be true to themselves, and they stand up to the world around them. Keep in mind, you are allowed to have multiple elements to your antagonistic force beyond just a bad, evil person, or even the nature of it all, like the cold, or maybe even inner conflict. The point is this: over the course of your story, you might realize there are several antagonistic forces within your story. Some are quick and easy, others radiate throughout the entirety of your story, therefore, the influence of that antagonistic force. Basically, your main villain doesn't need to be the main focus within the story, even though their force should be felt directly or indirectly as the influence to the story. The value of having two or more antagonists is you get to use multiple antagonists in a way that gives your protagonist levels of opportunity to evolve as a character. Even a best friend can begin as a pushback force, giving the protagonistic obstacles before they become best friends. Meaning, these two characters, they start off bumping heads and then they become best friends, and by being best friends it actually ultimately elevates both of them, which helps push the story forward, and in turn is something that becomes an emotional value to your midpoint and so forth. When in doubt about your narrative, you can use multiple antagonists to spread your story out. Maybe you don't want to let the main baddie be revealed main baddie be revealed right away, so create a weaker foe that handles the pushback of challenging your protagonist. Look at Game of Thrones. For those unfamiliar with the books, the TV show had several seasons happen before Daenerys made her way to King's Landing with her last remaining dragon. And keep in mind, before she even got to King's Landing, there was winter is coming, and it was the White Walkers. And then before then, it was the battle of the Bastards. And then before, you had right, you had Ned Stark Ned Stark was trying to figure out why the hand before him was killed, the king's hand was killed, and why Robert was killed, and then what's the conspiracy, what's being held. The villains kind of grew and built on themselves. Okay, so it's all right if you add different layers to your story and it builds kind of a little bit of depth. And if you look at it, even in the first season, as I was just saying, there were multiple antagonists from Littlefinger to Cersei and Jaime Lannister, even Viserys, Viserys, I think I said that correctly, Viserys, the bald guy, all have something to do with the overall antagonistic force pushing back on Ned and the Stark family, to the point where even Littlefinger is like, hey, I told you should never trust me, right? Anyway, final thoughts. What is the purpose of an antagonistic force? First of all, antagonistic force, let's just say that right. The antagonistic force is what creates conflict on the plot level and the scene level. Let me put it another way. A story has 5 basic but important elements: the characters, the setting, the plot, the conflict, and the resolution. The antagonistic force is the conflict in a story's narrative. All right? A reader, your audience, buys into your stories because of the journey of your characters as they make choices through the plot laid out over your setting while dealing with some form of conflict that has a resolution. You're not interested in a story where a person gets up, goes to work, gets a promotion, has all the friends in the world, comes home oh. All right, let me start that over. You're not interested in a story. You personally, me, I don't know. Maybe you are. Maybe, but most people are not interested in a story where a person gets up, goes to work, gets a promotion, has all the friends in the world, goes home, finds a genie somehow, and is granted 3 wishes with no issue, and ends up falling asleep on their pillow at the end of the day. No, we sit at the edge of our couches or our chairs or the seat in the theater, or however you're reading your book, when that person in the story wakes up to see their car is stolen. Who stole it? What happened? Who is the person where someone would who is this person where someone would take their car? Maybe they live in a horrible area. How about they finally get to work late and are fired, and their best friends end up being the person that gives them a job, but they can't handle the workload because they deal with depression or whatever it is, whatever the element is. Antagonistic forces are all throughout there in their form of those conflicts. Someone stole a car, antagonistic force. Does it get resolved? The journey to find out is what is interesting. They arrive late to work and their boss is a hard ass, antagonistic force. Does it get resolved? They lose their job. What now? They get a new job they are not good at, antagonistic force. Does it get resolved? Will they figure out Will they figure out the job, or is it too much for them? They live with depression, antagonistic force. Does it get resolved? How do they work through their depression and find a solution? Your antagonistic force is going to give your protagonist urgency, purpose, and drive to make choices to protect, defend, fight, run, hide, or become the hero we all need. And in some cases, sacrifice themselves for the greater good and literally jump on the sword. As in like End Days with Arnold Schwarzenegger. A little aside, keep in mind, I did say scenes and story, etc. You got to look at it like you have your entire story, which is your 3 acts, and there needs to be those elements there, right? Those the 5 basic elements. So your characters need to be in the full narrative of those 3 acts. There needs to be a setting that evolves over the course of the. We need to learn about that setting, world building. Need the plot, basically what needs to happen. Remember, story is how it happens, plot is what has to happen. They are not the same thing. Then you have the conflict, which is the pushback, making the plot interesting and difficult and not a simple thing. Then you have the resolution. There is a problem that has come to light in Act 1. The truth is revealed in Act 2, and Act 3 is the resolution of how all that works out. Now, take that, and you could break it down into acts. So if Act 1 should follow the same 5 elements, there should be characters that are developing, the setting should be growing and moving, we should be learning about the world. The plot of what needs to happen in Act 1 is different than the plot that needs to happen in Act 2, is different than the plot that needs to happen in Act 3. Even though there's a full narrative plot that consumes all 3 acts, you got to look at each act as its own small story. And there's a conflict in Act 1, just like there's a conflict in Act 2, as much as there's a conflict in Act 3, as well as there being the conflict of your main narrative through Act 1, 2, and 3 as a whole. And then, of course, there needs to be a resolution in Act 1 that propels your story into Act 2. And there has to be a resolution in Act 2 because there needs to be a solution found by the time they go into Act 3. And of course, there has to be a resolution in Act 3. And then you could look at scenes the same way. This scene exists. Am I learning about the characters? Am I learning about the setting in the world? Am I developing my plot, which technically should be first? What is the conflict of that scene? And how do I resolve that scene to get the characters out of there? And then you could do that with characters themselves. The character themselves sees the setting from their perspective. The character themselves is involved in the plot from their perspective. The character themselves have their own conflicts. And do those conflicts get resolved? And those are subplots. Okay? Hey, by the way, the next video in this series will be about 3 reasons readers don't care about your novel's characters and how to make them stand out more in a way that connects with your readers emotionally. Ooh, I like that. If you could go back in time to the moment you decided to become a writer and told people about it, what would you say to the person who discouraged you the most? Let me know in the comments below. I kind of like that question. Just saying. Anyway, want to learn a little bit more about improving your craft, maybe understanding the craft in general, some insight to the industry, and hearing from fellow authors like yourself through our podcast, please click that subscribe button and knock that bell icon so you don't miss out. Okay? Just saying, I really appreciate it. You're the best at this. By the way, as always, if I have to say it once, I'll say it again. We are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is to develop the right mindset. I'll see you next time. Thank you again. Bye.